Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation that encouraged me to make a fresh presentation. It's so fresh, it needs some editing. So I think of these situations where I'm presenting work of my own, but also collective work of many, as an opportunity, as a chance to keep thinking and reminding ourselves of sort of the political circumstance in which we are currently living in or reliving. So I always think of these moments, like such as this one, as yet another, step towards, like similarly with this idea of a lecture, is that it's work in progress, and so are our political engagements and efforts. It kind of never stops, and I am interested in this kind of perpetual, continuous movement of sorts. I would also, I would like to present this book, which there's a little section in this presentation that is stemming from the book. It's on the table. It's freshly published, and it stems from a research that, together with another filmmaker, Philipem Rizkem, it stems from a research that we did together. A research that involved collecting testimonies, filming with lawmakers, with lawyers mainly, but also testimonies from ex-prisoners, activists who speak about their understanding, but also their experience of being put in front of a body of justice of sorts. And we never made it into a film, but interestingly enough, the video made it into a script, or a series of scripts that we divided into these different chapters. And we called it a manual for the theater of law, as a also little joke, I guess, or commentary towards the Egyptian justice system. So, but let's start with the lecture. I will read it all. It's easier for me, so bear with me. Before the law sits a gatekeeper. To this gatekeeper comes a man from the country who asks to gain entry into the law. But the gatekeeper says that he cannot grant him entry at the moment. The man thinks about it and then asks if he will be allowed to come in sometime later on. It is possible, says the gatekeeper, but not now. The gate to the law stands open, as always, and the gatekeeper walks to the side. So the man bends over in order to see through the gate into the inside. When the gatekeeper notices that, he laughs and says, "If it tempts you so much, try going inside in spite of my prohibition. But take note, I am powerful, and I am only the most lowly gatekeeper. But from room to room stand gatekeepers, each more powerful than the other." Since 2017 in Egypt, the space for public discussion around human rights has been suppressed, hidden from the general public's eye, or perhaps not, kept under covers by its gatekeepers to continue and threaten its dissidents. The freedoms of expression in Egypt have been severely curtailed. Authorities use illegal warrants, forceful interrogation, Is this working? Oh, no, it's back. Sorry. I made this special effect. Hope you like it. Authorities use illegal warrants, forceful interrogation, extrajudicial probation measures, criminal investigations, unjust prosecutions, and inclusion on a list, so-called list of terrorists, to target human rights advocates, opposition politicians, and protesters. Hundreds of people have been found guilty following egregiously unjust trials or after being put on a trial by emergency tribunals for peacefully exercising their basic human rights. Torture and forced disappearance cases persisted, with thousands of people who are arbitrarily detained, including journalists, students, opposition lawmakers, company owners, and non-violent protesters. At least 56 deaths in custody were caused by or contributed to the continued use of cruel and inhumane detention practices, as well as the denial of basic health care to prisoners. Following egregiously unjust trials, death sentences were issued and executions were performed, including for drug-related offenses. Authorities introduced legislation further weakening women's rights and autonomy while failing to appropriately investigate or prosecute sexual and gender-based abuse. LGBTI people have been detained, accused, and given lengthy prison terms due to the sexual orientation or gender identity. Authorities cracked down on independent unions, strikes, and workers who voiced complaints or criticism. In addition to other issues, the COVID-19 vaccine rollout was hampered by delays in immunizing people who were most at danger. For demonstrating, residents of informal communities were forcibly removed and imprisoned. And authorities persecuted anyone who held non-state sanctioned religious beliefs, including members of religious minorities, such as the discrimination that happened against Christians in both legal prosecution, but also against practicing. Refugees and migrants who cross borders illegally were also, in a very arbitrary way, held in prison with undetermined period of time. So not really knowing when will they go out, what are they awaiting, and this is a very this is a very common way of practicing arrests, which is they can extend the first 15 days up to 3 times and then reissue. So you have these prisoners, protesters that are there without a case against them, and this is also the absurdity of the situation. But I would like to rewind a little bit backwards to the year 2011 and the beginning of the Egyptian revolution. So this is what I just described is the post-2017 period up until now under the Sisi regime. But if we move 6 years before 2017, I'm interested in how much has changed on the legal side of prosecuting people, and how many different laws were created in order to maintain that military regime or leadership. So there's two important laws that came together, or came to an existence in our everyday lives as Egyptians. One is spreading false, I wrote laws, but it's spreading false news. And that's what I'm doing right now, basically. I'm spreading false news, so please don't show that on the internet, because this is exactly the kind of law that prevents people from speaking about the ongoing political situation, and any kind of criticism is seen or goes under, I think it's Article 126, and under the clausure of basically terrorist act. So that goes under the spreading of false news. And but going back to my text, I think in order to think of that collective manual of sorts, or that collective momentum of that moment, I'm very much interested in a different kind of law or series of laws that were created before 2014 and the beginning, or like the taking down of the Muslim Brotherhood and the beginning of the presidency of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, is thinking about that those 2 years post 2011 where law or so-called law, like the gatekeepers of the public space were the people themselves. And so there was a moment of not only questioning laws as such, for instance, the anti-protest law, but also creating laws of your own within the public space that was not yours for 30 years. So people protested. They protested against so-called protest law, which exists everywhere, I think. The protest law, you need to get a permit in order to protest. Except that in Egypt you don't get the permit, or applying for that permit means that you are on the radar. So instead of applying for the permit to protest, people were protesting against the anti, protest law, the protest law. And it was interesting for us as a group also to see within that very short period of time how the protest law or the anti-protest law was carried from one leadership to the next, and by giving that law from Mubarak to back to the military and then to the Muslim Brotherhood, each time that law was newly enacted, it was how to put it? It was shared with the public space as something new, something novel, except that the law itself always sounded the same. And it sounded not only the same, but it can be traced back to the British Empire. And you can see that first enactment of law and the creation of the military on the hands of the Brits, really. And if you trace the original anti-protest law, it is a colonial law. And you can find it in the law department at the University of Cairo, that book of laws. Laws in Egypt seem arbitrary as they erupt in a reactionary mode, held onto by its makers, like an at this point, military man Abdel Fattah al-Sisi himself, currently the president of Egypt. But random they are not. They follow a trajectory that is made up of carefully preconceived notions of what's legal and what's illegal, or what is made to be legal for the people, and what is made illegal for the people. Their existence is determined by the state and its makers, the lawmakers, and they take as a target any form of dissidence or disagreement to these laws. So basically laws in Egypt are made for people to obey the regime and not question it, and for the regime, the regime makers, for them to get away with their own crimes. But there was a time when these laws were contested, and there was an attempt to change them. One of those instances was 2011 in Egypt, when we gathered in a protest on January 28th in 2011 on the so-called Day of Anger, with the purpose to bring down the regime. The groups gathered all over Cairo, and they started with not more than 10-15 people at a time. And maybe I can show you, because there's a lot of talking about something that you will see in the video, so maybe I'll just show the video. And that's the first video that I worked on ever. That was before the collective was created, and it was the first video that I edited, and then it continued from then. So it's also interesting for me to watch it with you together after all this time.
كنا في جامعة الدول، ضربوا علينا القنابل المطاطية، لا رصاص المطاطي، وضربوا واحدة ست في رجليها وواحد في رجليه هناك.
جينا من ميدان الجيزة، ضربوا علينا قنابل مسيلة للدموع، وجرينا هربنا منهم، كسرنا الكردون بتاعهم، وجينا مشينا من الدقي وصلنا لحد هنا. بس بنطالب بسقوط حسني مبارك.
احنا عاملين مظاهرة سلمية، محدش رمى طوبة.
قنبلة أمريكانية دي، أمريكانية، حسني جاسوس بيدعم، حسني جاسوس مش عايزينه، خلاص الواحد اتخنق، الشعب جعان، خلاص اتخنقنا.
Game over.
طلع حي. ده حي، ده خرطيش بيه.
ده روسي ده.
انا بصور على ده.
ده روسي.
نريد حرية، إخاء، مساواة. نريد حرية، إخاء، مساواة.
وجود الجيش عازل صحيح، بس مش عازل عن السرقة اللي بتحصل، لأن مثلا كان في أكتر مثلا من حوالي 10 ضباط قبضنا عليهم جوه المتحف وهم بيسرقوا ممتلكات، وهم بيعتبروا تخريب اسم الشرطة كانتقام من الشرطة طوال 30 سنة ذل. يعني
الشرطه الداخليه.
امتى؟
الكلام ده من ساعه بالظبط. تمام؟ وقربونا منهم خالص، وقفنا على الحاجز، وبعد كده قاموا جايين راجعين هم ورا حوالي 5-6 متر، وقاموا جايين نازلين فينا ضرب، واحنا قدامهم الوش في الوش زي الدبابه كده بالخرطوش اللي هو بيطلع البلي دوت مخرم وش اهوت. تمام؟ والقنابل اللي هي المسيله للدموع ديت زياده عن 50 قنبله في نص ساعه اتضربت علينا من ال3 شوارع بتوع وزاره الداخليه.
جنازه قدام وزاره الداخليه ضربوها بالقنابل المسيله للدموع وضربوا الناس اللي ماشيه في الجنازه. عايز بس
الطيران من فوق عمال بيخوف فينا، وبينزل الطيارات تلف 16 تنزل تخوف الشعب عشان الناس تمشي. احنا مش هنمشي، احنا قاعدين هنموت هنا، هنموت مش مشكله، يموت مليون عشان يعيش 83 مليون.
عايزين تقولوا حاجه؟
حكم الرئيس مبارك هو شبيه بحكم الرئيس شوشيسكو حاكم رومانيا.
اول مره امشي هنا اهو في الميدان ده بحريه واحس ان انا ماشي في بلدي، اقسم بالله ببقى خايف، ماشي خايف.
Don't ask anyone for our freedom. We will get our freedom. We are not cowards. We are freedom.
I will read a short testimony that from that day, which I only read recently. It's a short text that Philip and I wrote. I don't even remember it, but I think we wrote it because there was a lot of attention at the time around Egypt, and independent media were interested, such as Democracy Now! and others that did not have access to what was going on the street. It was also a period back then. We're talking about 11 days, and at the beginning there was no internet, there was no coverage, so there was very little actually coming out. Although now, when I think of the Egyptian Revolution, it's like one of the most televised protests of our time, I guess. Following Friday prayers on 28th of January, we joined protesters marching through the streets of Mbaba in Cairo, Egypt. The crowd of 100 that we joined kept increasing and continuously joined with other marches in the same quarter northwest of downtown Cairo. By about 1 p.m., the protesters numbered around 15,000, marching towards Gala Square and attempting to get across the Nile to Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo. In Gala Square, we met 2 other large marches from Giza and Muhandisin that had already tried to cross to Tahrir and had come under heavy tear gas fire. Shortly thereafter, the converged protesters stormed past the security forces and streamed into Tahrir Square. Afterwards, the security forces that had used brutal force to stop the protesters disappeared, and the central square of downtown was filled with demonstrators sharing one united call: down with Husního Mubaraka. In the early evening, protesters burned down the regime's National Democratic headquarters. The streets were filled with tear gas, burning police vehicles, and chants of celebration. I think the role of the testimony was very crucial at the time, and I think as a collective later on, a bit of a mad obsession with collecting testimonies, with collecting voices, names, dates, numbers. And the reason why is because a lot of those people would later on disappear or go to prison or won't give that testimony no more or change sides. So there was a lot of also fear around losing that access to information. And this is something that I think I focused on a lot, is going to factories, specifically to protests that were happening in factories, because that was the only period when that would ever happen, where you could go without a press card and without someone breathing down your neck to film and to collect that collective testimony of the period. So we also had this period of obsessing over content and over narrative, which when I look at it now, I feel it was an important obsession, because without it, I don't think we would have had potentially legal evidences of the crimes that were committed against people. Here I will read a short fragment, an introduction from the book, and then I will move towards the archive. Are you up with me still? Yeah. So this is from Philipem Rizkem, with whom I worked quite a lot on these videos, also on a feature film with a group of workers. How do you speak to that which is absent? To a power that one feels but cannot see? The law is like a fairy tale, or a truth we have unanimously internalized. The law dictates a way of being that we are socialized to comply with. The law is pure air. It is a work of fiction, a ghost conjured up by our collective imagination. It is only because of us that this ghost has any presence at all. It exists because we believe in it, because we perform this belief, even if just as passive bodies watching the law materialize in some massive stadium. In January 2019, Turkish authorities deported an Egyptian citizen because of a powerful man, a powerful gatekeeper, who demanded his body, an act legitimized by the ghost. The body was one of 486 bodies to whom these gatekeepers had handed death sentences in 2018. Again, the ghost allowed it. In July 2019, speaking to an Egyptian audience in Toronto, an Egyptian stateswoman mimes an executioner's knife slicing her bare neck to dramatize the fate of those who negatively portray the country. The ghost has got her back. The ghost that draws a particular global order, giving life to the ideology of the neo-colonial state. In his book, Cinéma et Politique, Christian Zimmer writes, "To grapple with ideology is to grapple with a phantom, since ideology has neither a body nor a face. It has neither origin nor base with which one could recast to provide the battle against it, with a precise and well-defined object. Ideology only manifests itself under the form of fluid, of the diffuse, of permanent polymorphism, and acts through infiltration, insinuation, and impregnation. Ideology does not have a real language. We are facing an authority built on an elusive system, legitimized by a ghost, and it is deadly." In 2018, our collective Musirin meets at Bard College in upstate New York. This is the first time after the coup in 2014 that we all gather together at the same location. This time the situation is different, and we no longer live in the same city, we no longer protest, we no longer collect testimonies. Our activisms shape around law-like behaviors of leaders that we haven't chosen, conditioned by the current regime and suppression. We meet to look into hundreds of hours of footage gathered during the revolutionary period, over 800 hours of material hectically and randomly organized on several hard drives. Oh. Ah, that's why. Gathered on several hard drives. In the weeks to come, we would feel a little like us again, us versus them, during that summer in 2018. On a campus surrounded by trees, by a beautiful river. For the next 3 weeks or so, we spent long hours going through raw footage that for the first time in years was looked into. We analyzed it and strategized about how to disseminate this data, these testimonies that belong to the public and should not be stored on our drives forever. But it wasn't an easy task, since most of this particular archive labor needs to occur on the level of the legal. Questions around security came up and how to continue to protect the ones behind cameras and those who, in many instances, found themselves in front of our lenses. In these chaotic moments during protests, cameras were often seen as a gaze out to the world, a magical piece of equipment that can suddenly bring the rest of the world's ears and eyes closer. A haptic device that looks back at the world, voicing out loud, fearlessly, speaking about what had just happened in the moment. But here in New York, that instance is no longer valid, and the situation is very different. We are not lawless, but in the limbo of laws that snowballed after 2012, since the dissolution of the parliament that very year. Since Sisi came to power, more than 175 laws and decrees were put into life to criminalize any dissidents. Looking through the footage, we realized how much work is needed to reconfigure what can be made public and what needs to be protected. Uneasy in this role alone, we consulted a number of lawyers and human rights defenders thinking about the possible repercussions of this archive going online. The next step was to categorize the archive, to create a hierarchy that consists of different paths and methods in which a user could follow while searching through footage. So as you can see, you have all these up under all videos. You have these different ways of, looking into the material. You can go through a place, you can go through a date, but also through keywords, which we created by identifying specific moments, so creating basically in and out points of specific moments in the archive that show police violence or tear gas or chants. It's a very interesting platform that I also, it's called Pandora, and it's open source, and it's really something else, and I would encourage you to look into that. So basically, it took us 3 weeks to create this hierarchy with locations, dates, maps, named and unnamed shooters, annotations, descriptions of events, and that's how it looks, basically. Okay, so this is the end of this presentation, but at the very end of my presentation, I wanted to make just a little read something very short about, I'd like to use these moments to speak about Alaa Abdel Fattah, who's probably the most high-profile political prisoner in Egypt at the moment. He's on a hunger strike for over 190 days, I think. So I would just like to say something about him and about the campaign that we're doing for his release and people alike. So I'm just going to read very quickly and then I'll give you a breather. Alaa Abdel Fattah, a fiercely independent thinker who fuses politics and technology in powerful prose, an activist whose ideas represent a global generation which has only known struggle against the failing system, a public intellectual with the rare courage to offer personal and painful honesty. Alaa's voice came to symbolize much of what was fresh, inspiring, and revolutionary about the uprisings that have defined the last decade. He has been in prison for most of the past 10 years, and since April 2nd, 2022, he's been on a hunger strike and is in urgent need of international help. Time is running out on Alaa. In May, Alaa was moved to Wadi Natrun prison, which is not as high security prison as before, when he was confined in a solitary cell at Tora. He still continues to have limited access to the outside world, to visits with his family, to correspondence, to books and newspapers. For years, Alaa has been denied, just saying that here, access to all of these things. And in this prison, he has more freedom. And the first thing that he received was a bed. So this is the conditions that we're describing. Since the beginning of Alaa's ordeal, his sisters, who are also activists, Mona and Sana, together with their mother, Layla Swift, have exhausted almost all possible means to release Alaa, and as they continue to fight against Sisi's regime, stretching their voices against ruling bodies, against buildings and organs of power, calling out the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and Sameh Shukri, her Egyptian counterpart, as it is in their power to call for the release of Alaa, to respond to the urgent questions around the reoccurring violations of human rights, including the case of Alaa and many other political prisoners who are stuck in the limbo of the Egyptian corrupt legal system. As we speak, Egypt is hosting COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, as Alaa puts, in Sharm el-Sheikh, and as Alaa puts it in one of his letters to his sister, where he says, of all the countries to host, they chose the one banning protest and sending everyone to prison, which tells me how the world is handling this issue. They're not interested in finding a joint solution for the climate. And to quote a friend of mine, we live in a constant production of instability. Ironically, we continue to reproducing so-called economically joint solutions that are, as always, there to benefit those in charge and to sustain their dictatorial regimes under law-like infrastructures. As we speak, Alaa has been on a hunger strike for over 190-something days, and his life is under a serious threat as he's getting weaker every day. Alaa is an Egyptian citizen, but he also has British citizenship since 6 months. His demands are clear, as an Egyptian, to assign a judge to investigate the complaints that he has already submitted, which document the violations he has been subjected to since the day he was basically abducted on September 29th, 2019. As a British citizen, for the British consulate to be allowed to visit him in prison and to enable him to communicate with his lawyers in the UK so that they can take all possible legal measures regarding not only the violations he has been subjected to, but all the crimes against humanity he has witnessed during his imprisonment. And here's the campaign that you can follow, freealaa.net, and you can also basically support the campaign and write an email. Here are the things that we're doing in the next weeks before COP27, because it is an opportunity to think of, how can you have COP27 while people are imprisoned unjustly and against violating basic human rights. So this would be all, and here I'm also sharing with you a project, call it a project, a collection of readings from a book that was also published this year, actually published by a group of people who are his friends, showing 10 years of his life. And it's a collection of essays, texts, tweets, articles that him, Ala, has shared. And I invited a number of artists, also his friends, but not only, to read from the book. And we created this online, together with Radio Papeza, an online reading of You Have Not Yet Been Defeated. And the project continues. Anyone is welcome to read. And I'm going to just play a short excerpt, and that's it, because I know we're so.
So what can you do? What can you do realistically, that takes into account what you are about? Well, here is what you can do. Ignore the activists, ignore the revolutionaries. We have to face bullets, we have to face military trials. It doesn't matter really what you do. It doesn't matter if Facebook is going to reveal my information or not. I have to assume that I'm being constantly watched, that everything about me is public. It doesn't matter. But what matters is ordinary users who use your products to practice their agency. When you decide that they cannot decide to choose a pseudonym, then you are negating them the right to negotiate their identity. The right to negotiate your identity it's not in the Charter of Human Rights, but it's actually essential to most rights. Negotiated identity is very important. I get to choose whether to reveal who I am and how to reveal who I am and decide who I am on my own terms and on my own basis.
Palestine on my mind. In the beginning, it was on me to pass on the news. Most of my ward mates are not allowed visits, and none of us are allowed newspapers, so my weekly visit had become the primary source of information. News of the Zionists' protracted electoral impasse and the deal of the century kept rolling in. I remember trying to analyze and share the news quickly, broadcasting it by shouting through the hatch in my cell door. That was probably when my ward mates first got to know me. In any case, Palestine was always on my mind. Then came the pandemic, cutting off visits and the news along with them. I protested with a hunger strike that lasted 37 days. I told my cellmate about the time I visited the Empty Stomach Solidarity sit-in tent in Gaza. I've been on hunger strike 4 times since, and each time I remember the Palestinian captive strike. Palestine's always on my mind. Despite the defeats, I'm still grateful to the revolution for all it gave me. For one, I was able to visit Palestine twice. I never say I visited Gaza. Not only because Palestine is indivisible, but because anyone who visits Gaza cannot but realize that they're in the metropole of Palestine, its beating heart. There, you swap the Palestine of dreams, metaphor, and poetry for the Palestine of flesh and blood and tears and sweat. To isolate me from my ward mates, or perhaps to contain me 1 week into my strike, I was moved to another ward where newspapers were allowed. After 6 months of being denied the printed word, I held a state newspaper in my hand. The first thing I see is a photo of a Palestinian child wearing a cabbage leaf on her face in place of a surgical mask. I scan for news of the pandemic and try to imagine how the world has changed. Try to imagine how my son, Khalid, is coping with the closures, the social distancing, the masks and swabs. I always take pride in the fact that the first stamp on his passport and the last on mine before my imprisonment is from the Rafah border crossing. Khalid was born at the height of the revolution and visited Palestine before he was even 1 year old. On that first visit, I spoke of my family's attempts to live a normal life under exceptional circumstances with no end in sight. I thought that was the Palestinian experience, so I ended my speech with the words, "I am Palestinian." Words that seem so naive now, that the whole world is living in exceptional circumstances with no end in sight. So did we all become Palestinians? Of course not. Only the children of Gaza are photographed wearing cabbage leaves instead of masks.
And yeah, thank you. You could download all these readings or listen to them online, and also order the book. It's a beautiful publication, really. It's a very interesting publication because it really it tells you a lot about like the last 10 years, really, through Ala, but also like through the life of Ala and his voice, but also through collected in a way things about him as well, like the article that he writes about Palestine that was published in Mada Masr, which is the only independent newspaper in Egypt, was actually written by his mother. And she wrote it in his name after taking notes and visiting him in prison. And then she produced this amazing essay about Palestine. So, yeah, thank you. I've only recently came across your space, and we discussed it a little earlier, like the idea of maybe thinking also politically about space or what constitutes a space. And I was thinking about like the nomadism of like how, where, with whom we produce content politically, and how little is actually needed to be, doing that, doing what you're doing. But I imagine it comes with challenges. So it's 3 of you, right, running this initiative. Can you share a bit more about this last program that you did? And yeah. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, like literally. All right. Yeah.
We are 3 people. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking too much into this microphone, but I think Tomasz and Nela would agree that we are not the only ones. Like, we always ask other people to create the program with us. So, for example, this one last screening, we were discussing also with the curators of the festival, photograph festival, who also gave us some tips on who is doing what and what would be good to include in this topic. And of course, then we have Vojta, who wrote the text. So without him, we also wouldn't have such good insight into the topic. So yeah, we are a small gallery, but I think that for the size of us, we have quite a lot of it's more of a net of other people who will help us. So I think it's kind of balanced, the amount of things that we do during the year and the amount of people who work on it. So definitely not anything super huge. We are happy to always include other spaces than our gallery into the program, because it is very hidden. Not that hidden, but it's not really in the city center, so it's better to kind of reach out and try to do the program somewhere else, like here, or I don't know. I don't know what else to say, but it's a pleasure that we can also invite guests, and and I think we are good. with what we have.
We are not nomadic.
No.
We are based in the gallery, but we decided to have your talk here because it's more in the center.
I guess it's a better place than our gallery for a presentation. Yeah, but we are not.
Yeah,
we are not just moving. I don't know. If anybody has any questions for Jasmina, that would be, yeah, please.
I think it's quite a deep subject you're diving into, but it's on a theoretical level still. When you're an artist and you're dealing with concepts, and that's where the theory comes to. But at the same time, have you thought of entering politics and trying to be the beast from within? You know, complying with the rule, but kind of letting it explode from the unexpected places.
Well, I never really thought about that, no, and but I don't think I will be good at it, first of all, and but I do have friends who attempted at, you know, like the first presidential elections. There was a huge group of, you know, people who wanted to involve themselves politically, more in like an actual, like, hands-on, you know, brain change to the system manner. Of course, that didn't end that well for many of them, or like many of them are not living in Egypt anymore, for instance. There's the Revolutionary Socialist group, which goes way back to, I mean, I don't know, maybe the 60s or so, and they are quite vocal and I mean, they also kind of present the workers' side, which sometimes not always is mirrored in like the party movement, because of the whole, you know, Marxist idea of having, you know, we have factory workers, so the informal labor is not very well represented in Egypt at the moment still, even 10 years later. The workers are not only those who are in factories, and not also only those who are so-called informal workers. There's so many different ways of, yeah, but just going back to your question, I think it's it takes a certain also type of a person who could do that and who could think like that. I was always interested in the other side, you know, to think of, and that's of course like idealism, like political idealism, kind of sneaking in of that, you know, that revolutionary momentum or that post-revolutionary momentum that we still think about, analyze, work to, maybe not towards, but work from, yeah, I forgot what the rest of, but yeah, I don't think I would want to do that, but yeah, I mean, it's also kind of, you know, down with nation states, you know, down with the wall, but I totally see the necessity to work from the belly out, and that is also something that is happening. And I think it's a very, very good question also when thinking like also about the law and the legal players, from, you know, top-down governmental, but also human rights defenders who enact specific also roles within the system, and that is also what the book is a little bit about. Is, you know, you're costumed for the role. You speak a certain language with one guy, one judge, with whom, you know, you use a more of an Egyptian dialect, versus with another you become much more you know, Quranic, or you use the classical language and you behave in a certain way. And that's what politicians do. They wear a certain costume. You could see that during the revolution as well, and in the aftermath. Sadly, creating also this dissonance within the protesters' movements. A lot of disagreements and also ego-driven attitudes that kind of crushed that movement from within, in a way, or contributed to.
Maybe can I ask you? I was curious about your activities around like Syrian collective and about collecting the materials during the Egyptian revolution. But I'm more curious around like the practical stuff. How did you like? Because I'm not sure if it was safe or not. But how did you let people know that they can send you materials, and how did you collect it?
I mean, it all started with the 18 days in Tahrir, so that was before Mussolini, before 858 archive, and the way in which it happened, I mean, it happened spontaneously. It happened on the square, in the middle of the square, where you had tents of lots of tents where people slept and occupied the space, and there was also a media tent where I wasn't in part of that thing, but there were people who were gathering data. People would come, drop off. We're talking 10 years ago. DSLR was huge, you know, and everyone would come with their camera and just drop the material and then go back and drop the material and go back. So some of the materials that we had were gathered on those drives by protesters. And then the rest also, we continued to do that. And by we, I mean like lots of people, different people would continue to film. And at one point we initiated a public screening situation where we basically put a screen, or like more like a piece of cloth on the middle of Tahrir, and we projected some of the videos that we edited. I mean, because here on this archive you have the raw footage, but back in the day we would quickly edit the materials and then share them online, and you know, share them, but also screen them in the squares. And what we did at the time is also during the screening, like share with people that we have videos and footage, if they want to give us more footage, or if they want to take some of the videos from us and screen it somewhere else. And that's how a very important actually campaign was brought up called Kazibun, which means liars, against the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. So that was the ruling body at the time, the military ruling body. And Kazibun was a campaign initiated by some people who were linked to our group and others, to make screenings in other neighborhoods, but really targeting specific military personnel with their image and where they live, and it was really pretty guerrilla, and it was good. And what was good about it is, I mean, the fact that suddenly you didn't have one screening organized by this group of people, but you had multiple screenings where you could in a cacophonic way even see some of the videos being reshared on these different screens, and then it went beyond Cairo and went into neighborhoods, and I believe, or many of us believe, that the fact that the videos were so spread out and reshared and republished is what allowed, I mean, I didn't say the important thing is the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, they presented themselves as the protectors of the revolution and the transitionary body from Mubarak to the first democratic elections, where in fact they would arrest people and put them, and protesters, entire groups, and put them in front of military tribunals. So there was another campaign called, actually led by Mona Saif, Alaa's sister. That's where I also started to collect testimonies, really, from actual protesters and people who were imprisoned, is the release of more than, at the time I remember, maybe 40,000 prisoners in a very short period of time. People, like citizens, put or treated as though they're military, put in front of a military tribunal. So you can imagine, like a group of us, half an hour later, you have a sentence, and long sentences. Luckily, these sentences were easily navigated through and like dismantled by human rights lawyers, but it was a big campaign also. And I think these kind of videos and sharing them in the public sphere, like physically, allowed for many of those who were arrested to be released. But now you can't do any of that. I mean, you can't take your camera and go to Tahrir and film a palm tree or whatever. You're immediately a suspect. It's also it was a special time for this to happen. Here you can also go, and most of the videos are translated. We had a number of great contributors from like people we wouldn't even like know from all over the world who would like translate to so many different languages. It was intense, and they had their own mailing list, and so it's great because you can watch it and also understand it. But these are edited videos. Yeah.
They can ask privately afterwards. Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming.